Welcome back to Dolphins in Depth. I'm your host, Omar Kelly, here with my colleague, Barry Jackson, man of many mysteries. Barry, obviously, the Miami Dolphins, we discussed in the last podcast, went in depth into the offensive depth chart, breaking down everything from the upgrades at tight end to the question mark at interior offensive line. You could find that in the previous Dolphins in-depth episode. But today we're here to talk about the defense, Barry. And I don't even want to go in order. I want you to give me, Barry, your biggest concern about this Dolphins defense moving into 2024.
Unquestionably cornerback. And here's why.
Cornerback.
They found a competent starter in Kendall Fuller to play opposite Ramsey. But I have no confidence whatsoever that they have an effective number 3 on their roster simply because of Kader Kohou's regression last year. Now, could Kader Kohou go back to the guy who allowed an 82 passer rating as a rookie instead of the guy who allowed 138 passer rating in his second season? Absolutely. We saw the ability 2 years ago. Perhaps that ability is still there and it can be extracted from him. Could Cam Smith justify being a second-round pick and show the ball skills that we saw last offseason? Sure. But to necessarily say either one is going to definitely be an effective number 3 corner, or to say the same about Ethan Bonner, who's an intriguing young player with a nice skill set, or to say the same about Nick Needham, who's now focusing on safety, I think is very risky to say. So to me, you might have a need ultimately where if you don't like what you're seeing in 11-on-11s in training camp, you might be out there looking for a better version of Eli Apple. I hope that's not the case, but that would be my concern because they're putting a lot of faith in Kader Kohou after a year when he had the second worst passer rating against of all NFL cornerbacks. To me, that's a risk. And that, to me, is an even bigger concern than the Chubb-Phillips health, because at some point both will be back. Now, you made a face about my corner concern. Do you not share that concern?
I think you make an excellent point, and I never looked at it from the standpoint that you're looking at it. You're looking at it as Kader Kohou was more of a liability than an asset last year, and I have to agree with you. Now, a lot of that was scheme-specific. I mean, Kader Kohou took a lot of beating in these crossing routes. The Dolphins Vic Fangio's defense never figured out how to stop a crossing route the entire season, and teams picked up on it and attacked it and exposed it. And that was just something that it's very glaring to me in terms of, okay, was that scheme specific? Was that the defense? Was that too much zone coverage? I'm curious to see how Kader rebounds and responds. I've heard that he's working tremendously hard. This is a young guy who's got a lot of talent and a lot of upside, but it's not like the Dolphins don't have options. And let me put it to you this way. If I'm not comfortable with what Kader is giving me in the nickel, you know what my plan B would be, Barry? Javon Holland as my nickel cornerback. Javon has played that position in Oregon. He's very well versed at playing that cornerback, that nickel role, could be moved into the star. That might mean you add another safety, or that might mean Nick Needham comes onto the field as just a deep roving free safety, and then you put Javon Holland in there. But as long as Kendall Fuller stays healthy, and let's hope that Cam Smith develops and progresses and takes that next step, I think they should be fine. I think I'm okay. I'm a little bit puzzled that this is right where you go when we've got 7 journeyman defensive tackles, 3 injured pass rushers.
Players, yeah.
Yeah. And this is where you go for your number one concern?
Well, Greer says you can never have enough corners, and I got news for him. He doesn't have enough corners. And I would just feel better about it if there were another veteran around, not to take snaps from Cam Smith or Kohou, but just to be there. And perhaps this guy's added in August if Cam Smith and Kohou don't play up to what the Dolphins hope they will play up to. I'm like everybody else. I want to see Cam Smith get every opportunity. If all goes well, he or Kohou will be your number 3 corner. The other guy will be your number 4 corner. Maybe Ethan Bonner surprises all of us and we have a big party for him. But I'm just concerned ultimately about counting on youth, especially youth that struggled last year in Kohou. So let's hope it goes well, but I do have some uneasiness about it possibly not going well. I love your Holland idea about nickel, but then Do they want to spend the money to go out and get a Justin Simmons or someone like that? Because remember, if they give Justin Simmons the money he's looking for, that takes away money from next offseason. And then there's a guy on next year's roster that's not going to be here because you're going to be up against the cap and giving two an extension, giving Waddle, Phillips, and Holland their extensions. So you have to measure everyone you sign this offseason, Omar, against a player you're likely going to lose next February and March as a consequence, because the cap does carry over, as you know.
You make an excellent point there. To me, I think you could even make do with playing Javon in a nickel role, especially if you got a guy like Nick Needham or Elijah Campbell who can roam back there in a deep safety spot. I like Jordan Poyer. I like that addition. I think it makes sense, especially for the money. I think he adds a dog element to your team. I think you're going to have a leadership presence in the secondary that you've probably been missing for quite some time. I like Jalen Ramsey shadowing, and I'm curious what your take on this. I watched Cam Smith all training camp, most of the exhibition season, except for that final game against Jacksonville where he got beat by a double move and obviously fell into Vic Fangio's doghouse and never was able to get out. I saw him play on special teams. Yes, there have been concerns and questions about his maturity, concerns and questions about him handling himself as a pro, becoming a professional. But the ability is there, Barry.
I agree. And that's why I'm not panicked about this. I would just like a safety net in case he struggles. But I want to make clear, I want to see Cam Smith get every opportunity to be your number 3 corner or your number 4 corner. He deserves all of these reps this summer. He deserves an opportunity in preseason games. I'm just talking about the worst case scenario of what if he's burned consistently in camp? What if he's burned in preseason games? Hopefully he won't be. Hopefully he'll be every much the player that Chris Greer thought he would be. I guess from an overarching standpoint, Omar, my concern about this defense, and we'll get more into other positions, is this. To me, they're a guy short at every position except inside linebacker. You got plenty of bodies at inside linebacker. You're fine there with Jordan Brooks and David Long and Anthony Walker and Duke Riley, where Tyndall probably isn't even going to make the team. Former Giants linebackers in that group as well, who's going to be a special teams player for you. But I think every other position on defense, you are one guy short. If there's an injury, if a young player doesn't deliver, obviously on the edge, if they begin the year with Jalen Phillips, which is a possibility, but without Bradley Chubb, which is a very good possibility, then your other starter is Shaq Barrett along with Phillips. But then who's your number 3 and 4? Do you assume Chop Robinson and Kamara are going to be ready to take major snaps? At safety, they're likely a body short because we love Elijah Campbell and Nick Needham. We hope they're on the team, but having another veteran there would help, especially if they take your idea of playing Javon at nickel. And we just talked about corner. And you and I are both on the we need Calais Campbell or another defensive tackle bandwagon. So to me, one guy short at every position, and that is what gives me unease about this defense, especially at defensive tackle.
Yeah, if we're talking about heading into training camp, we are one guy short at every position. And as you know, Barry, because you've done these transactions for a while, there's a steady influx of guys coming in and out of training camp. I mean, you're talking about 12 guys might be signed. And that doesn't even include the waiver wire fines. Are you saying to me, Barry Jackson, and I hammered the depth concerns all year last year. I looked like a moron and an idiot early in the season until we got to December and January. And then everybody's like, oh, you were right. No, I was an idiot earlier. So remember that. Are you at the point where you think that waiver wire fines, when teams pare down their 90-player roster to 53, won't do it defensively, and we can't survive with the Elijah Campbell fines, or we can't survive with Eli Apple the return of Eli Apple? You're not comfortable, it sounds?
I'm not at defensive tackle for the reasons we talked about. The only thing that eased my concern a little bit was the stat we talked about that Kyle Krabs had mentioned, that on 55% of Baltimore's defensive snaps last year, they played only one tackle, which obviously would be Zach Sealer 99% of the time on this team. And they played 3 defensive tackles on fewer than 5% of the Downs and Mike McDonald's defense for Baltimore last year, the one that Weaver presumably will use here. So that eased my concern a little bit about defensive tackle. But no one on the waiver wire defensive tackle is going to come in and be Christian Wilkins. Meanwhile, at cornerback, I would say if Cam Smith struggles in August, and hopefully he won't, there's no one you're going to find on the waiver wire who's suddenly going to come in and rescue you as your number 3 corner. So I think for the most part, they're either going to have
Eli Apple rescued you last year, Barry. Eli Apple rescued you last year.
He did for a time, but he also obviously gave up a lot of catches as well. To me, if you have any doubts at all about whether you're good enough at number 3 corner, then Chris Greer and Anthony Weaver and the defensive coaches should say, you know what, I'm going to take Omar Kelly's idea. I'm going to put Javon Holland at nickel. I'm going to go out and spend the money on Justin Simmons. To me, that gives you peace of mind. It makes you a better defense. But the question is, at what price? What would Justin Simmons play for? That's the intriguing element of all of this. But I don't think they have enough. I don't want to be in a situation where we get to September 7th and they're looking for another edge player at Walgreens or at Walmart, where they're down to 2 rookies. And if Phillips and Chubb, if neither of them can play for the opener, and Shaq Barrett, who's going to be 206 years old at some point soon, I don't want to be in this position where I'm saying, where are my edge players? And I'm looking down the street in Miramar saying, can we find one who can come in and play 20 snaps in the opener? So all those 4 positions worry me. Do you have enough at edge? Do you have enough at backup safety? Do you have a number 3 corner on the roster? And have you replaced Christian Wilkins? There's not the money to replace all of them with good players, but I think you do have to take a hard look in the next month and a half at everyone who becomes available at those positions and ask yourself, who improves your team? Now, I know you and I are on the same page about defensive tackle. What's your number 2 concern defensively on this roster, personnel-wise?
Personnel-wise, it would have to be the safety spot. And I'd edge because I you know what? As talented as Chop Robinson is, as productive as Mo Kamara is in terms of production of what he did in college, I looked at both the training camp. And the number 1 question I walked away from, not training camp, but rookie camp. And the number 1 question I walked away looking at both from a build standpoint, their athleticism is, can they set the edge in the NFL against a Patrick Paul-esque figure, against a Teron Armstead, against an Austin Jackson? An Austin Jackson, as athletically freakish as Chop Robinson is, who is the better athlete specimen in terms of hulking, I'm going to move you before you move me? And that would be Austin Jackson to me. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Austin Jackson is the greatest offensive lineman in Dolphins franchise history or is a top 10 offensive tackle in the NFL. But when you just look at those statures of those 2 smallish, and they are both smallish edge players and rushers, they do not have the physicality of a Bradley Chubb or a Jalen Phillips. They do not have the size of them. And I'm like, are they going to be pass rush specific only players? And that is a little bit of concerning to me. Now, safety spot, I mean, let's be real about this, Barry. They are 1 injury away from being a disaster at safety. They already had that disaster in Javon Holland being sidelined and back and forth on the roster with his 2 knee injuries. It could go left. Your entire season could go left for you if Nick Needham can't play safety. And I also think that Ethan Bonner is probably in that safety mix as well. I know he spent most of last season as a dime cornerback. So it's a possibility that you have bodies that can help you. But, could this team benefit from the signing of a Quandre Diggs or a Jamal Adams? I don't know.
Yeah, I think they definitely would. I want to make a couple points on the edge players. You mentioned Chop Robinson and Kamara. Can they set the edge? A couple things that encouraged me about Chop Robinson. One was, and I know sometimes, we're skeptical of some of the Pro Football Focus grades, but he was rated as a run defender, top 15% in the country as a run defender by PFF last year, for whatever that's worth. Also, I know someone who's close to Manny Diaz who said that he spoke extremely highly of Chop off the record, meaning to associates, not what he publicly says, which you can't put a lot of stock in, but he really sees great upside in Chop Robinson, not only as a pass rusher, obviously, but as a run defender. So maybe that allays our concerns a little bit, even though we both saw 15 tackles in 10 games last year, was extremely worrisome with Chop Robinson. Kamara was a competent run defender. But again, you're playing a Colorado State, not a Power 5 team, and you just don't know how that will translate to the NFL level. I guess with the veteran edge players, Omar, who have come off the board the last few weeks, like a Bud Dupree, was there anyone who you thought set the edge well enough and could rush the passer that you said, maybe they should have taken a chance on that? Or do you think they should go into camp with just this top 5? And also you can throw in the UCLA rookie who led the country in quarterback pressure in 2001. Exactly. So should you just go into training camp with this group, regardless of whether Chubb and Phillips is healthy, start the season and say, I want all of these snaps taken by rookies. I'm not bringing another veteran to consume some of these snaps until we know for sure by mid-August whether Chop Robinson and Kamara can give us meaningful snaps out of the gate this year.
You know what, Barry? It's funny that you say that because I have a master plan and I will unleash it on you right now. I view that this team is a defensive tackle and a 3-4 edge away from being what they need to be defensively. And you know my obsession with Calais Campbell, 37 years old. He's older than dirt. He probably will enter the NFL as the oldest player in the NFL if he does sign. And the fact that we have not heard Calais Campbell talk about retirement, we also have not heard or seen Calais Campbell on television on a consistent basis. That hints to me that he's not done playing. He just hasn't found the right home. And at this point, if I'm Calais Campbell, I'm 37 years old, I'm not stepping foot in the OTAs. I'm not doing any mini camp. I might show up the third week of training camp. I'm going to keep my body in shape and stay in condition. But all this foolishness that we're talking about, I'm not doing any of it. And I've dealt with and have close friends who once guys hit like year 9, football is football. They know what it takes. They know how to get their bodies right. And I'm saying, if I'm the Miami Dolphins, I'm saying to Calais, don't sign with anybody. Call us if you get a deal that absolutely floors you. But we would like you to join our team at some point during training camp. And I think that he could be the finishing pieces at somebody who can hold you down on early downs as an edge setter while the Tier Tarts of the world fill in with Zach Sealer to replace Christian. And then on third downs, go on to the interior. And to me, that's 500, 600 snaps easily. I'm not saying that you got to play a ridiculous amount of snaps. Come do your soon to be retired life while still being part of the NFL at 37 years old, Calais. So to me, I'm not doing a single thing until I know where Calais Campbell starts, because I think he's the perfect fit for this defense. So I'm fine with trying out the Mo, Curley, and Larry and the 7 defensive tackles. I'm fine with figuring out this rotation, and it feels like, to steal somebody from Twitter, Zach Sealer's playing the NFL version of The Bachelor. He's trying to find out who compliments him well, who would he like to take on a second date, and I'm so into this, like, who wants to be Christian's new salt, Christian's new pepper. So that to me is where my focus is. And then I definitely would like to add Calais Campbell later on in the process.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. A couple of things with Calais, unless you and I or another media member has a chance encounter with him, what Calais is up to is probably not going to leak. His agent is Tom Condon. Condon clients typically are able to keep their information to themselves until they actually sign somewhere, at which point one of the national guys will probably report it. And then on the issue of who could play snaps alongside Sealer, obviously Benito Jones and Tart, when they go with a nose tackle, those two will be competing for those snaps. When you play with 3 defensive tackles, then I think Neville Gallimore probably has a little bit of the edge over Jonathan Harrison. Gallimore, remember, has a history with Austin Clark, the Dolphins defensive line coach. The Dolphins are intrigued by the skill set. He was a starter earlier in his career for Dallas, has been more of a backup. Obviously, the Cowboys' run defense was abysmal last year, but I went back and I looked, and I don't hold that mostly against Neville Gallimore. He wasn't playing enough snaps where you'd say he was at the root of the issue of their Cowboys, of the Cowboys' run defense problems. So with his body type, with his skill set, I think Gallimore has the potential to be a serviceable player. Do you want him playing 55 snaps a game? Of course not. But I think in maybe the 15 to 25 snap range, I think you could get serviceable work out of him. Here's the question to me, because we've talked about Justin Simmons, we've talked about Campbell. If you said to me, or I'm going to rephrase this, if I said to you, the Dolphins can have both Campbell and Justin Simmons, but that $18.5 million in cap space that's going to come available from Xavier Howard's contract June 1st is going to then suddenly shrink to $14 million or to $12 million, meaning less carryover space for next offseason, meaning less free agent help next offseason, not as much money for Waddle, Phillips, Holland extensions next offseason. Is that worth it to you, or do you want to be conservative and patient and say, let's hold on to our cap war chest? Or do you go all out and say, let's sign these two players if it can be done for a reasonable amount of money? It's going to take more than what it took for Odell, I think, for both of these players.
Oh, absolutely. I don't think either of those players get out of bed for $6 million a year. So You're talking about the bulk of your cap. It really comes down to me, Barry. Are they still all in? Are we still taking an all-in approach? Do we feel like we are a championship caliber team? And I don't see any reason why they wouldn't. When you consider the Buffalo Bills have been weakened by having to carry quarterback contract and then having to purge their roster to get under the cap. As impressive as the Jets allegedly have been this offseason in terms of the additions that they made, it all hinges on Aaron Rodgers. So, they're going to be a contender in it as well. The Patriots, I'm not even worried about what the Patriots are doing. They're rebuilding. They've got a young quarterback, and unless he performs like C.J. Stroud, I'm not even worried about it. But then you got to worry about Baltimore and Kansas City. And right now, from my standpoint, those two teams are juggernauts. I mean, I know they're going to begin the NFL season, and it's probably going to be the must-watch game of the year. But if I'm not competing with them now, when will I ever be competing with them? Because soon enough, in 3 years, I'm going to be carrying a quarterback's contract, and I'm not going to be able to afford a respectable roster. So I probably would spend that $12 million. If you told me I need to spend $12 million to get Calais Campbell and to get Justin Simmons and worry about tomorrow, I'm worrying about tomorrow.
I think so too, because I think the worst thing that could happen would be if they take a step back and don't even make the playoffs, because then how this entire rebuild is framed and viewed changes entirely. You cannot call this rebuild a failure by any means. They've made the playoffs twice. Now, has it been a rousing success? No, because they haven't won a playoff game. They haven't advanced in postseason, but it's been sufficient results so far for what you would hope for a rebuild. Not great results, sufficient, but you need another step. And if you take a step back this year and miss the playoffs altogether, then Steve Ross can justifiably sit there and say, I went to all of this trouble and I went through this pseudo tanking where Brian Flores sued me and
pseudo tanking, Barry, pseudo tanking. They tanked.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I say pseudo only because, as we know, it wasn't an all-in tank because of the Fitzpatrick. But don't get me started on that. So anyway, if they
you wanted Josh Rosen, didn't you? You wanted.
I did. Just to assure, having pick number one, you'd have Joe Burrow. Everything would be wonderful. But to me, if you miss the playoffs this year, which I think is a real risk if you don't upgrade the defense over the next 3 months, then this whole rebuild tank, whatever you want to call it, is going to be viewed as, I don't want to say a total failure, but as something that was not successful, because then it would be 3 years into this without a playoff win, 2 wild card losses, and not even making the playoffs. And you look at the rest of the AFC, even if the Jets are just good enough to become a wild card team, one team has to exit. Who would that team be? Right? I mean, Miami would have probably as much of a chance as anyone. Now, you don't worry too much about Denver and obviously in their quarterback transition. I don't worry about the Raiders. The Chargers are going to be good eventually because of Harbaugh, but I'm not sure it happens this year after losing their receivers, and they're obviously going through something of a rebuild. So who's the team that did not make the playoffs last year? Is it Pittsburgh now with Russell Wilson and Fields? What team you think bounces Miami out if the Dolphins take a step back? That to me is what worry Greer and motivate him to go out and try to get a Campbell or Justin Simmons.
I think Houston is here to stay. I think Pittsburgh is coming. Who knows what Cleveland is going to be able to do, because we don't know where Deshaun Watson is. He hasn't been good for 2 years. We don't know if he's ever going to get back to being good.
Cincinnati. I totally forgot about them missing the playoffs last year without Burrow. So obviously you're going to put them in the playoffs. So someone in last year's playoffs is not going to be in this year's playoffs. And if you're looking at teams to remove, sadly, the list would probably start with the Dolphins. So to me, they're still a fringe playoff team. It's a good team, but a fringe playoff team. And that's why I think I'm with you. You got to keep your foot on the pedal. And even though you'd ideally like the carryover cap space, I still think if you can get impact defensive players this offseason, you've got to spend your money and do it. So I think we're on the same page with that.
I think the only position that they, outside of tight end and wide receiver, that they clearly upgraded the roster was at inside linebacker with the addition of Jordan Brooks and Walker, Anthony Walker. I think that's a clear upgrade, especially when you don't lose a guy like a Duke Riley as a primary backup. And then you still have David Long as a prominent starter. Who knows what's going to happen with Channing Tindall? I don't even worry about him anymore. He's a camp body. But I agree with you. There is no clear-cut upgrades at any of these other positions. And if you do suffer one injury, it could all fall apart like a house of cards where it's just going to crumble. But obviously Anthony Weaver's here. We don't necessarily know what he's going to play or how he's going to play or the style or the approach that he's going to take just because we haven't seen it. I believe we will be able to see practice next week, Barry.
Correct, on the 21st.
Yeah, so I'm excited to see what finally gets revealed to us. But what do you think are the fair and reasonable expectations for an Anthony Weaver defense in 2024?
I would hope that they would be nearly as good against the run as they were last year, where they allowed 3.8 per carry, which is top 5 in the league. You would hope their pass defense is better. I'm not sure that it will be. The reason why you think it might be is hopefully we get the best version of Kendall Fuller and a healthy version of Kendall Fuller, which would compensate for basically the games that Xavier missed last year. So ideally, you'd be getting a full 17-game corner. You'd be getting Jalen Ramsey for the whole season, right? That's number 1 on the list. We didn't have him until November 5th. Right. We didn't have him until November 5th last year. And pass defensively, you would hope to have a full season of Javon Holland, who obviously missed after the Jets game for the most part, the duration of the season. To me, a huge question will be, are you better at inside linebacker with Jordan Brooks replacing Jerome Baker, or is that a wash? What's going to be interesting to me, Omar, with Brooks is this. We know he's solid against the run. He's been a high-volume tackler. Is Jordan Brooks in pass coverage the guy who was very solid last year, 93.2 passer rating against, had his first career interception last year, returned it for a touchdown. He handled difficult assignments consistently in Pete Carroll's defense and Seattle's defense and handled them pretty well last year. Is he that guy, or is he the guy from his previous 3 NFL seasons where he allowed 119 passer rating in his coverage area with 12 touchdowns and 1 interception, that 1 interception coming last season? So last year, there was a tremendous improvement in Jordan Brooks in coverage. To me, if he stays that guy, then he's an upgrade, a slight upgrade over Baker because of the high volume tackles. But if he regresses and goes back to the guy he was in pass coverage with Seattle in 2021, 2022, then I'd be very concerned that at linebacker, you've gone a little bit backwards. How do you feel generally about the inside linebacker group? And by the way, I wanted to tell our listeners, Channing Tindall's cap hit goes from $1.4 million to $212,000 if he's cut. So right now he looks like your number 6 inside linebacker, unlikely to make the team. Those would be the cap consequences.
I don't even worry about Channing Tindall anymore. If he can't help me on special teams, he can't help me. I feel confident in terms of where they are in the inside linebacker unit for 2 reasons. David Long talked about how there's a lot of carryover from what he did at Tennessee. Anthony Weaver actually was a part of Mike Vrabel's Houston staff, where he was a defensive coordinator at Houston, and Anthony Weaver was his defensive line coach. So there's a lot of carryover for what David Long knows. That will benefit them. I also believe that even if Jordan Brooks or Anthony Weaver, and that's another thing, Anthony Weaver, his skill set is pass coverage. So they can all help you. They can all play roles. That includes Duke Riley. So I think they're a deeper unit from the inside linebacker spot than they were in previous years.
I agree. To me, the biggest thing to correct, you nailed it this week, crossing routes. Fangio had no answer for him whatsoever. They were killed consistently by him. And one thing that I've charted on MiamiHerald.com, some of our readers might know this, is what Josh Allen has done to Dolphins inside linebackers has been unspeakable over the last 3 years. Absolutely horrific. Passer rating close to perfect, 12 touchdown passes, a completion rate of over 90% when targeting Dolphins inside linebackers. Is that going to change? I'm skeptical because, as we talked about, Jordan Brooks and pass coverage, good last year, not good his first 3 NFL seasons. We know David Long's strength is as a run defender, not in pass coverage. Duke Riley, competitive in pass coverage, but he's been targeted on a bunch of those Josh Allen throws that were completed. So, and also with Dalton Kincaid, that's even makes the Dolphins inside linebackers even more vulnerable now that the Bills have a top-end, high-end tight end. So I'd be very concerned when you play Buffalo about your inside linebackers consistently being a liability against a Buffalo Josh Allen-led offense and pass coverage. Anthony Weaver's got to figure that out.
Absolutely. No question about it. The hot spot for Anthony Weaver is figuring out how to mesh all that talent on Dolphins defense. I don't know if I could say all that talent, but it's a substantial amount of talent. He's going to have Jalen Ramsey shadowing. He's got Javon Holland, who is looking for a major contract. We'll see how that plays out during the offseason. And then he's got Zach Sealer there and 2 injured, very talented defensive ends. When do you see Jalen Phillips and Bradley Chubb? If you had to wear a crystal ball, if you had to put a crystal ball, pull out your crystal ball, when do you see them getting cleared to play in a football game? Not football activity, game.
Yeah. And again, for everyone, this is just guessing. This is not reporting because they've kept it closely guarded. With Phillips, I was encouraged that he told Andrea Adelson on the sidelines of ESPN's Spring game he's going to be healthy for this season. I took that to mean it's not a guarantee he'd be ready for week 1, but I took that to mean it's September. We've seen him walking around. He looks good. I think September, whether it's week 1, 2, or 3, is very realistic for Phillips. With Chubb, with the ACL timing, it's interesting. He had it December 31st. Jordan Brooks had an ACL injury virtually the same date for Seattle a couple of years ago, was back by August. So it would be doable for Bradley Chubb to come back from his ACL for the season opener. But I think at the same time, it also, even though it's realistic, it might be a little ambitious. So my guess is for Chubb, October. If he beats that, great. My guess is for Phillips, we see him in September. And with Cam Good, with his torn patella, who knows? But I think you have to be prepared for at least week 1, having Jalen Phillips maybe on a snap count, on a pitch count, right? And then having to use heavy Shaq Barrett and having to use Kamara and Chop Robinson, unless you bring in another veteran edge. Your feeling on this is what?
I think it would be irresponsible if the team didn't begin them on the PUP.
Interesting. Why?
Just the precaution. I know we want to rush players back, and then what's the story we always hear from players? Yeah, I really wasn't the same player that I was last season. I was just playing at 70%, and I feel so much better a year removed from the injury. So I've always used the year timeline for when a guy finally starts to get to feel back to themselves. And really, we're sitting here pushing these timelines at 9 months, and that's just being aggressive to me. And I know Jalen Ramsey put on his cape and played like Superman coming back from his knee injury, but I don't think that that's realistic. And if I'm Mike McDaniel, I am preventing myself from doing anything that can harm my team in the future, and having either of those individuals suffer a setback or re-aggravate or aggravate something else, trying to mask for what their issues were. That to me is too much of a risk for long-term future. So I would actually have both of them begin the year on the PUP and not look back at it.
So it's time to call Melvin Ingram off the rocking chair in Charlotte again, right?
Time to Melvin Ingram would be my breaking case of emergency edge guy, but it's time to see what your rookies can do. Give them both the first month of the season to see where they are and how much they can contribute, and then eventually gracefully bring those young men back. But I know Jalen Phillips and Bradley Chubb, they're probably going to force their way onto the field at some point during the exhibition season in terms of practice field, and then try to make it into the first month of the season in terms of playing. But that's ultra aggressive, and we'll see how it plays out. On that note, this has been another episode of Dolphins in Depth for you. Hopefully, we'll continue to have more episodes during the offseason program. Next week, we've got our first look at the Dolphins on the field. Everybody, rookies, veterans, and we'll be here to wrap it up for you here at Dolphins in Depth.